Chapter 1. Hunger in Paris.
My name is D'Artagnan. I was once captain of the King's Guard for the present King, Louis XIV, and before that for his father, Louis XIII. You may have heard of my three friends, Athos, Aramis, and Porthos. We were all musketeers, which means we were trained to use a musket, a kind of gun. But our favorite weapon was always the sword. To win a fight with a sword, you have to use your brain, and at the same time move quickly and cleverly on your feet. In the old days, when we were young, some people said that a whole army could not beat us. It was my job to serve kings, not judge them. But there are times in every man's life when he has to make an important decision. A decision that will not only change his life, but the history of the world. I am going to tell you the story of how I came to make such a decision. My story begins in the early summer of 1667. Louis XIV was on the throne of France, with his wife, the Queen Marie-Thérèse, at his side. His mother, Anna of Austria, also lived with him at court, and in a way I felt responsible for the safety of them all, although my first duty was to the king. France was at war with Spain over the Spanish Netherlands. War is a hungry master. It needs money to make cannons and guns and to buy food for its armies. So all the money and food that should have been used to feed the poor of France was going to the war. I had been to Paris to see how bad the situation was. What I saw there made me sick. People were dying of hunger. Children were lying in the streets too weak to cry, too weak even to hold out their hand for a piece of bread or an apple. They were just waiting to die. Those who still had strength were breaking into shops and stealing whatever they could. It was the job of my musketeers to protect the shopkeepers, but many of my men felt bad about fighting the poor. Their job was also getting more and more difficult as the people became hungrier and hungrier. The palace at Versailles is not far from Paris, but it is a long way from the suffering of the people. As I walked into the gardens and down the steps past the fountains, I saw the king. Or should I say, I saw the king's party. Some 20 or 30 men and women, beautifully dressed, wearing their fine wigs, which were long, curled, and well powdered. At the palace, it was just another day of pleasure. The king was playing a game with some of the courtiers, while the ladies stood in a circle watching. The game they were playing is called boule. A small wooden ball is thrown some distance from the players. Then, each player throws a metal ball to try to get as close to the wooden ball as possible. The player who gets his ball closest to the wooden one wins. Louis slowly lifted his arm and threw his last ball into the air. As the ball hit the ground, the king shouted, "Have I won?" It was clear to everybody that he hadn't, but no one said a word. A young courtier went up to the group of balls and stood with his back to the king. He bent down, as if to see more clearly who had won, and without being seen, pushed the king's ball with his foot so that it was now closest to the wooden ball.
"You have won again, Your Majesty,"
shouted the young courtier. After all, a courtier's job is to make the king happy. Louis raised his arms and smiled, and everybody shouted, "Bravo!
Bravo! Bravo! Bravo!
Is there no man here who can beat me?"
Louis loved to win, and then to say how much better he was than everybody else.
No, Your Majesty, you are unbeatable,
said the young courtier.
As you men are no match for me, I shall have to find a lady who can beat me.
Louis went up to a young lady, shyly watching the game. Her name was Louise de la Vallière. She had only been at court for a few weeks. I had noticed her the first day she came. She had seemed in need of a friend, so I took the opportunity then to go up to her and say, "Are you happy here, mademoiselle?" She had looked at me, surprised that the captain of the King's Guard should speak to her.
I miss my family,
she had said.
but I will get used to it, I suppose.
"I expect you will," I had said with understanding. After that incident, I made time to speak to her. But I was not the only one to notice her. The king had noticed her too. And now he took Louise by the hand and led her to the bowling green. I could see the queen, Marie-Thérèse, trying to hide her anger. Louis handed Louise a ball. She looked at it uncomfortably. She did not find it easy being the king's new favorite.
I have never played before, Your Majesty.
With those hands and that beauty, you have already won my heart, even if you do not win at pool.
Louise threw the ball carelessly into the air, and by pure luck, it landed closest to the wooden ball. A look of anger passed briefly over Louis's face, but then he smiled.
I think you do not tell the truth, my dear Louise. You have surely played before.
Louise looked worried.
No, Your Majesty. It was beginner's luck.
Never mind. How about some music and food? Louise, you will come with me.
Louis put his arm around her and led her towards the pavilion, where the musicians were waiting. "Your Majesty!" I called out. Louis turned.
Ah, D'Artagnan. Will you join us?
"Your Majesty, we must talk."
Talk. Can't you see I have better things to do? You know Mademoiselle de la Vallière, I think?
I wondered if the king knew that I liked her too. "Yes, Your Majesty, we have met."
Good. Come then, and eat with us before you go about your duties.
"Your Majesty, we must talk. The situation in Paris is serious."
I don't want to hear about Paris. Don't the people of Paris know we're fighting a war? Frenchmen are dying to make France great, and these lazy dogs complain about not having enough to eat.
At that moment, I saw Fouquet, the king's Minister of Finance, whose job it was to decide how to spend the king's taxes. He was with Colbert, his chief advisor. Fouquet and Colbert hated each other, but they tried not to show it. Fouquet was afraid of Colbert's honesty and the fact that Colbert knew that Fouquet was using a lot of the king's money to build himself a palace.
Ah, Fouquet!
Said Louis, seeing the two statesmen coming towards us.
What is this business about fighting in Paris?
Yes, Your Majesty, we know about it. It is quite serious.
Well, what do you plan to do about it?
There are 3 things we can do for the poor. 1, send less food to our armies in the Netherlands. 2, give them food from the stores. Or 3, we can simply shoot them.
The army must be fed, and I do not want to shoot our people, unless it is absolutely necessary. So, open the storerooms.
The food there may not be very good, Your Majesty. It has been there since last year. Most of the fresh food goes straight to the army.
Give it to the poor anyway. If they're really hungry, they'll eat it.
Yes, Your Majesty.
Now, gentlemen, let us have some music with our meal.
I followed the king to the pavilion, where tables stood loaded with food from all over the world, rich meats and exotic fruits. I couldn't help thinking of the people dying of hunger in Paris. When the music ended, I watched Louis leave the pavilion with Louise. And so, it was with a heavy heart that I went to my room that night. I had served France for nearly 30 years, but I had very little to show for it. I had thought of asking the king to let me go, so that I could marry and have a family, but now... Athos had retired to his farm, Aramis had joined the church, and Porthos finally had time to enjoy himself. But I was still tied to my duty. I would soon be an old man and had still not enjoyed the simple pleasures of being a husband and father. Now I felt that I never would. As I entered my office to plan the guard duty for the next day, I found a message on my desk. I opened it and saw at once that it was from Aramis. It said, "Dear D'Artagnan, I have called a meeting
of the Four Musketeers for tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. at the usual place. It is very important that you come. Godspeed, your friend
and companion, Aramis." I wondered what it could be about. For Aramis to call a meeting of the Four Musketeers, it must be something important. I decided to tell the king that I had urgent business in Paris and had to leave early the next day.